Welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. Now, in today's episode, I'm joined by Andy Ziolkowski, an impact investor helping support early stage food and ag tech companies, really all driven by creating a more sustainable and healthy food system that will support the growth of the next 2 billion hungry mouths to feed in the next 30 years. Now, Andy knows a thing or two about investing in disruptive early stage companies with over 30 years experience of venture investing behind him. And I've got to know Andy pretty well over the last few years at various global events and the agri and food tech events where he frequently moderates and hosts panel discussions. So it's a great delight, Andy, that you've agreed to join me on the show. And thanks very much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So Andy, I'll tell you what, let's take it all the way back and tell me about, growing up, some of the key kind of influences, in the life of a young Andy growing up.
Well, if I go very far back, I was on your side of the pond. I was born in Preston, Lancashire. And my parents, my father was Polish and my mother was Hungarian. They were displaced after World War II. And we moved to the U.S. in 1957. Arguably, we were immigrants and looking for a new life. And my parents, like many immigrant parents, education was this sort of the main way to improve yourself. And so I spent a lot of my time working towards that goal. Early on, my goal was to be an engineer. I studied engineering. And so having, I think, a real discipline, and I guess I would, look to both my parents and several of my professors who really got me started and gave me, the framework, which I think is a big part of, how I run my life now.
Yeah, no, great. Yeah, absolutely. So engineering was very, so that was a real kind of area of interest and love for you when you were growing up?
Yeah, so I grew up outside New York City, a place called Long Island, which is a suburb. And there was a very large aerospace company. This was the 60s. And, going to the moon was, this is past the Sputnik era. And so that was something that was on the minds of a lot of people, certainly me included, and engineering and eventually physics, which is what I also worked in and majored in, were things that I looked towards. And this company, Grumman Aerospace, which was based on Long Island, is where I worked. In fact, I was a Grumman scholar and competitive program, and I was able to go to a very good school as a result of my efforts back then in the 70s. And I got to meet quite a number of astronauts who landed on the moon. And, that was the heyday of the US space program until, of course, what's being done today.
Yeah. Incredible how much that inspired people,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And, hard work and quite a number of my friends, colleagues from back then have launched successful careers in different fields, academia to entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Tell me, with the hard work part, is that more kind of a discipline when you think about, your parents and the journey that they've had? And coming over to the US, for instance. I'm not sure, for instance, like your parents, what languages they spoke, for instance, when they first.
Oh, well, they spoke 7 languages between the two of them.
What did they?
Yeah, so I could barely speak English. That's why I went into engineering. But, interestingly, and this is a tie-in a bit to what I'm doing now, we wound up on Long Island because my uncle was a potato farmer on the North Fork. And so I studied engineering, not ag, but I got to experience farming through family and got to see what hard work it was. And, we headed out there and spent many weekends on the farm and getting to know what it's like being a farmer in the U.S.
Yeah, no, great. I'm sure that experience was very useful later on in your kind of career, your investing career, and you being able to kind of empathize with the farmer, as it were. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I think farmers, I think, if you think about what they do, they're entrepreneurs. In many cases, in the world of row crop farming, you plant, you harvest, you turn your inventory once a year, and so you bet a lot on how that crop grows and what yields they produce. That's when they say bet the farm, it comes from somewhere, and in essence, you got to think carefully about what you do and how you plan for the year.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Tell me, when did you get clarity from a view? I mean, look, you spent your career in investing, as it were. When did you get kind of clarity, from that kind of love of engineering and physics towards kind of investing and the kind of career path that you were going to eventually go?
Well, it was sort of, you never know. And I've told my kids, and I've told people about my career path. It's you could say unorthodox. It's the random walk through life. I worked after graduating, getting my engineering degree. I worked for several years at this company on Long Island. They sent me to Princeton. I spent several years there in graduate school. And then I quickly realized, my major professor at the time was applying for research dollars. I thought he was a lot smarter than I was, and I saw how he struggled to get research funding. And it was an epiphany for me. I was in my mid-20s, and I realized that if he was struggling to get research money, I'd be on the street with a tin cup. And so I said, is this career, do I want to go down this path? And I went and sat down with my professor from engineering school. At that time was the dean of the engineering school at the University of Pennsylvania, a fellow named Joe Bordogna. And I said, Joe, this is what I'm dealing with. And he said, have you ever thought about business school? Have you ever thought about going to Wharton? And I said, no. We talked about it. And within several months, I was in the program. This was back in 1979. And when I was there for 2 years, given my technical background, I was looking at career paths like consulting, which was a common path, management consulting. But I was thinking hard about taking a position at GE in their management training program. And I was seriously evaluating an entry position in Schenectady, New York at the large steam turbine division. And as luck had it, one of my professors, again, one of my mentors early on, was a fellow I used to play tennis and squash with. He used to beat me hands down, but we had great fun. And one day I was walking off the squash court with him, and he said to me, what are you going to do when you get out of Wharton? And I said, well, I told him about what my choices were. This is 1981, mind you. And he said, have you ever thought about venture capital? And as we were walking, I didn't want to look too stupid, but then eventually I said, Bill, what's venture capital? And he told me that a good friend of his, who was a very successful entrepreneur, had sold his company and set up a venture capital firm. In essence, it's a family, or was a family office. And so as a result of that random walk after a squash match back in 1981, I wound up in venture capital, not really knowing much of it. I went and met with this fellow. His name is Jack Whitehead, and he's probably best known these days as the benefactor of the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research at MIT, which he founded in 1983. Jack passed on quite a number of years ago, but he's left quite a legacy there. And early on I was involved with it. But my start in venture capital was purely by chance. So I think my recommendation to younger people is, if you have someone, a mentor from school, from university, maintain those relationships because they can be very helpful to you later on. And in my case, two of them really were responsible for me getting or going back to business school, which I really didn't think of back in 1979, and two, winding up in the industry I've been in actually now, not 30 years, it's coming on 40. So,
yeah. Well, also when you're that young as well, sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and,
sure.
So it's great that you had your eyes open, and now looking, as you say, 35 or coming up for 40 years, you've had a whole career dedicated to kind of venture investing. Tell me, when you just take a little step and look at the career as a whole and look at, quick whiz through, as it were. I know it's a long time, as it were.
Yeah.
But, maybe a couple of things that resonate for you that you look back on fondly, or that give you kind of satisfaction when you think about your time doing, as it were.
Well, for me, I'm very much people oriented, and I take great satisfaction in many of the entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, in some cases, who started companies straight out of university, graduate school, who benefited from, I think, my guidance and help and funds in getting launched. And the satisfaction in both the success of those companies, but more importantly, in the success of those individuals and their accomplishments. Now, they haven't all accomplished. There have been failures, as I'm sure you well appreciate. And in some cases, helping those entrepreneurs in repotting them in other companies, or repositioning them, or basically being frank with them and saying, you're not a real entrepreneur. You probably best should go back and work for a more established company. Think twice about, do you have the risk aversity profile in some ways to do this? So that's what I look back on, and I hope have helped quite a number of people over the years.
Oh, no, you have for sure. That's the case. And is it the kind of is it as much about mentorship as anything else when you think about individuals that have gone through that journey?
Well, I mean, mentorship's part of it, but as a investor and I think board member, I've been active as board member of many companies over the years. It's really to provide quite a bit of strategic advice to companies. Hiring obviously is a big part of it, but also making decisions on the direction of the business. Are you going in the right direction? Should you pivot? Should you continue? Should you even just sell and cash in your chips or take down the tent? So I think I've played a role, and I think most VCs, active institutional investors, should be doing that on a regular basis. I think the challenge with I think what I do and what VCs do in general is time management. I'm always very conscious of how many boards, how many companies I'm involved with, because I don't think you can do it justice. 5, 6, maybe 7 boards, if you're lucky, is the maximum, at least in my opinion, in companies. If you're going to be active and providing ongoing support. So those are some things that I look back on and think about relative to a career in this business.
Yeah, no, great. No, thank you. And how has it evolved? I'm thinking about you've worked in providing venture across different sectors and segments. I think it was predominantly life sciences before you got into the food and egg space, right? So
right.
So
Yeah.
what do you see as the main differences between, maybe where you started and where you are now in terms of the industries that
Sure.
you work in?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, when I started in 1981, I would say when I look at the NVCA, the National Venture Capital Association directory, it was a pamphlet, a handful of VC firms, and it was still rather collegial. You got to know many or most of the players, the senior players in these firms. I did at an early age. And many of those people mentored me, Mort Collins, Tony Evnan. I learned a lot from them when I was getting started, watching them, how they ran board meetings, et cetera. So the industry has grown. And as you said, I initially started in healthcare. Jack Whitehead, who I started with back then, was a successful entrepreneur who formed a company called Technicon in the medical diagnostics field. So he understood quite a bit. I learned a lot from him. I mean, here was a guy, a college dropout who started a company and sold it for, north of $500 million in 1980.
Wow.
Similar profile to guys like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, bright people who I think just had this entrepreneurship and urge to start a company and did it quite well. I learned a lot from him. And interestingly, one of the first companies we invested in that I worked on was a ag company. Back in the early 80s, biotechnology was new. Companies like Genentech and Hybridtech and Biogen were formed. And we invested in a number of them at Whitehead Associates. But we also invested in a company called Plant Genetics, which was in Davis, California, and was one of the first venture-backed ag biotech companies. And so it was quite an experience. I didn't really know ag biotech or didn't know much about that field other than my early experience with my family. But that was my exposure back then to ag. And as I think about the differences between healthcare or life sciences and ag tech, I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels. I mean, a lot of the technology back then, for example, and even today with gene editing, is applied both in life sciences as well as in agriculture, ag tech and food tech potentially. I think the challenge is always adoption. Farmers are by nature very conservative. You do have regulatory requirements and challenges, and depending on which route you go, especially if it's a GMO product, if that's what you choose to invest in. So that's, you could say, similar in some respects to the FDA and requirements there, although I'd argue that it's probably more expensive and could take longer. But market adoption seems to be the biggest challenge. I think farmers, whether it's approved, for them, it's a question of whether the product works in their backyard, whether it's a neighbor's farm or whether it works on their farm. And so that's probably been the biggest, one of the biggest differences, in my opinion, in traditional ag tech. Food tech is different, but that's as it relates to ag tech.
Yeah. How's it different with food tech?
Well, food tech, I think, as you can appreciate, given what you're seeing around us, has just changed so much. I mean, food tech back, call it 10, 15 years ago, was a sleepy area, and large CPG companies would develop maybe some interesting extensions to products. But this advent of alternative protein, alt protein, and whether it's plant-based or cell-based products has really changed. And a lot of it's being driven by the consumer. I think consumers, whether it's Gen Xers, my children, you want to eat better. You're willing to pay more for it. You really understand what's in labels. And so I think it's really changing how the world eats, for the better, I might add. And there's been significant growth, I think, not just in companies and innovation, but also in investors coming into the sector.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Just taking it back with something you mentioned earlier. Clearly, the mentorship and the work with, as you said, when you came into the industry, working with Jack. What was Jack's surname, by the way?
Jack Whitehead.
Jack Whitehead. And you said
Yeah.
he left a real kind of influence on you.
Oh yeah, quite a bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I learned a lot. I mean, and this was again something that I look back again based on your question. When I started with him, it was very much of an apprentice program in the true sense of the word. I mean, I would follow him. I would, in essence, carry his bags, would travel, go to board meetings, we'd visit companies, and we'd compare notes. I mean, it was a small office. There were basically four of us really working full time. And I learned a lot from him. As the venture industry has grown, it's harder to do that. We try within our shop to do it as best we can. But I do think an apprentice program like that, for me at least, was an important catalyst and helped me learn what to look for, what to be wary of, and helped me in my career along the way.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great to get that perspective. And so tell me, I mean, you I know about the experience you mentioned with your family, with the potato farm, and your, some of the investment early on in some of the ag tech. But you then made a decision. It looked like around 2006, as it were, and there was a kind of journey where it was like into the food and ag space.
Right.
Tell us a little bit around that. That was now 15
Sure.
years ago, as it were.
Yeah.
So what made you make that step? And
Well,
no.
So after I worked with Jack, I was recruited to join the venture capital group of an investment bank in New York called First Boston, predecessor to CS First Boston now. And so I joined and eventually headed it up in the 80s. And when Credit Suisse acquired First Boston, they divested of all principal business. They had a merchant bank, which we were part of. And so I started, opened up an office with another fellow here in Connecticut, where I am in the Canaan. And we invested for our own account. And I had a great life. I was you could argue, a lifestyle business. I was cycling to work and seeing my children when they were young. And
sounds great.
And so I had a cup of coffee. In fact, an old friend of mine, in fact, the fellow that I knew years ago, invited me for lunch. And, he said, what are you up to? And I told him. And at the end of the lunch, he sort of pushed back and said, Andy, you should really get a real job. And I looked at him. I was really startled. I said, what do you mean a real job? He said, well, you're doing well, but, I think, you really should take advantage of what you've done. And it turns out he knew this guy in Indiana. And turns out that guy, his name is Ron Musin, became my business partner, still is. And Ron at the time was heading up Dow AgriSciences R&D group. And he was working with the state of Indiana. And he had this idea to set up a venture fund dedicated to food and ag. And he quickly realized that it's a great idea, but he didn't know anything about venture. And through this friend of mine, I wound up meeting Ron, and we got to know each other. And, again, is when you're starting a fund, it's a bit like getting married. You date first, and we spent many months getting to know each other on a personal level, but also trying to understand how he evaluates businesses, what excites him, compare notes. he complemented my background. He's a plant physiologist, PhD from Berkeley, very, very sharp guy. I admire and respect him. And so, we spent, I would say, better part of that year trying to figure out what a fund should look like, what areas we should invest in. And obviously, given my limited background in investing in ag biotech, I had some experience, but really what I brought to the table was a real, at that time, over 2 decades of experience. So, and we hit it off. And, we launched the fund. Our goal at the time was to raise $100 million. It was a lofty goal. Dedicated fund, food and ag, first ever. And we had gotten a commitment from Credit Suisse, their asset management group at the time, to be our anchor investor. They were managing money in the state of Indiana. So, and they also knew me because of my involvement at First Boston. So we felt we were off to the races. Now, that was important, but it was still a slog, first time fund. And we had a minimum or first close target of 35 million. And that commitment, $5 million, came in June of 2008. We had gotten that $5 million commitment. It was from Eli Lilly. They at the time owned Elanco, the animal health business. And we were really pumped. We were going to have a closing, but it had to get approved by their various executive committees, which was fine. And then they said, well, it meets monthly. There was no meeting in July because of the holidays. August, they had something else. Finally got the commitment. It was September, the Wednesday after Labor Day, 2008. So we were ready to close, and Ron and I and our lawyer said, sounds good. How about the end of the third quarter? What can go wrong? Well, let's see. There were Lehman Brothers, AIG, and a score of other failures. And as Rome was burning, Ron and I, we were sitting there contemplating our futures. And as we joked, well, we could work in the food and ag business. I could always work behind the meat counter. And so we were fortunate to close in December of 2008. We quickly realized that we weren't going to raise any additional money given the market conditions, and we put it to work. So we had a number of successes early on. One of our first investments, Divergence, was sold, bought by Monsanto. Aratana went public, and we were encouraged by our existing LPs to raise a second fund, because 35 was, you could argue, small. And so we knew that we needed to expand the team if we were going to do that. And there are different paths to do that on. But we found out, we realized that one of our co-investors in Divergence was a fellow named Bob Shapiro. Bob had been the chairman and CEO at Monsanto. And he and a fellow named Nick Rosa, who ran the ingredients business at Monsanto, and eventually NutraSweet when they were spun out, had started a group called Sandbox Industries in Chicago. And they were investing in various things. They had created a fund with the Blue Cross organization to invest in healthcare. And back then they were thinking about raising a venture fund in ag, which they knew, and food. And so we sat down with them around that time and told them what our plans were. This was around 2011 or thereabouts, 2010, 2011. And we quickly realized maybe we should just do this together. And so we formed ostensibly a joint venture, which really became the basis for Cultivian, Sandbox, Food and Ag Funds 2 and 3. And we've been investing, out of both those. Well, now the third fund, Fund 2, is fully invested, and it's been a great ride. And we've had a very complementary fit. I mean, if you look at the senior team when we formed it, Ron Musin clearly knew the technical side, R&D. He had the domain expertise. I brought the venture experience, and both Bob and Nick had operating experience. Bob was, he had taken Monsanto when he first started. I believe the market cap was around $5 billion. I think when he left, it was somewhere around north of 50 billion. So he knew how to create shareholder value, relying on technology and transforming Monsanto from what was historically a chemical company into, an ag tech business. It was a great basis for forming this, and we've grown the team over the years, and we're obviously looking forward to continue expanding and raising additional capital.
Yeah, no, great. It's great. And just think, you could have been living a very kind of, your work-life balance, cycling, and but it sounds like it was another chance meeting or another discussion, and eyes opened. I think the thing is, with all the stories that you've told me around this, about how things have developed for you, it sounds like it's about having your eyes open, being open to things that you didn't necessarily know, and going through the kind of doors that that are open. So
yeah, that's right. I think you have to be open-minded, willing to take risks. I think as I've interviewed people for careers in entrepreneurial businesses, if someone asks me about the terms of the retirement plan or the pension scheme, those are the wrong questions. That individual isn't necessarily suited for life in a venture-backed company where there's quite a bit of risk.
Yeah.
I do think for me, it's, I've been fortunate. I look back and I don't regret any of the moves. I mean, sure, you regret either not making an investment in a company that's done well, or making an investment in a company that hasn't done well.
Yeah.
So those are regrets, but that's the nature of the business. You can't, in the venture business, spend too much time looking in the rearview mirror. You got to look forward and look at what the new challenges are, new technologies, what's going to disrupt this industry. And there's a lot going on. I think, when Ron and I started, we were asked by potential investors who, said, food and ag, is that a niche? I mean, is there technology in food and ag? And I think a lot of people have this idyllic view of ag like green acres, and you see the tractor in the distance, and no one really has maybe until recently, more of a sense of how food comes from the field to your fork. And when people asked us back then and said, "Do you have sustainable deal flow?" we were like, "Sure." We were very, certain of it, but really didn't have the data to back us. Now we have significant data to show, our deal flow is phenomenal. We look at 100 deals for every deal we invest in, if not more. I haven't looked at the latest count.
Is that right? I think 1 in 100, is it? Basically?
Yeah, 1 in 100. I think it's more than that. And there's, and I think there's sort of this you look at what's happening in innovation. You've got innovation certainly in the old areas in genetics, new breeds. Gene editing has been a novel discovery, but also more recently in software, the applications of software, big data to ag, clearly robotics, labor-saving devices are growing, in part because labor costs roughly 60% of what it costs to run a farm. In many cases, varies a little bit depending on what region of the country, crops you grow. And now, especially in the U.S., I mean, immigration issues and COVID have created other barriers. So, those are things that are causing people to look at technology like robotics. And so there's just a lot going on that we didn't see back, over a decade ago when we started this business. It's exciting. I mean, you hear these young entrepreneurs pitch, whether it's in ag tech or food tech, and you think, wow, hard to believe. What an exciting idea. Now, can you make a business out of it? Is it a business? Is it a product? Those are obviously questions, but no shortage of innovative business concepts for us to look at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It sounds like it's been some journey, right? And probably in 2006, if you would have, know what we know now, back in 2006, it would have surpassed your expectations around disruption, innovation, adoption. I mean, even beyond your wildest imagination, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we didn't anticipate the influence of software and robotics as much as it has. The alternative protein area just didn't exist. I mean, there were veggie burgers and they tasted terrible and no one really thought of them as a real growing category. So the influence of consumers and what's available today is just phenomenal. There's just been a lot out there for us to look at, and it's very exciting. And I think the other piece of this, which is in part driving where we go next, is this area of sustainability. When we were fundraising, we met a guy who when we were making a pitch about investing, Ron and I were going through our spiel, and it was like you're because you were doing so many of it, you felt like it was a production for theater. You knew the words and on autopilot. Next thing you know, this guy's saying, "Time out. You're not pitching this correctly. You're a sustainability fund." We go, "What?" He said, "Think about the areas you're working in. As it relates to increasing crops, dealing with water. Water is a big issue. 2/3 of fresh water is consumed in ag, and that's an area of interest for us. Dealing with food waste. And when you step back and look at the specific areas within food and ag, there was a significant overlap between this and this movement towards sustainability. So, I think as we look towards Fund 4 and hopefully beyond, I think more recognition of that in our thinking and where we invest will be, I think, will be critical. We're going to take, because I do think there's a growing recognition that dealing with things like soil health, carbon, if you look at where issues regarding sustainability are, they overlap, and we need to address them and deal with them as a nation, as a world, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me, do you find that the modern day entrepreneur now that's pitching you, one of these 100 that are looking, are they just more mission driven now than they were before? Is it now all about impact and solving the problems out there in the world that you're finding? And has that changed much?
Oh, it has changed. I would say, and I don't have data to tell you what percentage, but I think that is it half, maybe close to half. There's some recognition, and maybe in some cases even a major reason for the formation of the company. So yes, but it's definitely been a big part of it's the trend, and we expect it's going to continue and it'll grow.
Yeah. But it must give you a lot more, you mentioned earlier about some of the joys that you've had with seeing companies succeed and entrepreneurs develop, but it must give you a lot of satisfaction being part of that disruption in a cause of such goodness, Yeah.
Well, that was one of the reasons, at least for me at the time, when Ron and I formed the fund, I decided to do it. I mean, for me at the time, it was, well, do I want to do another fund? I mean, if someone said, gee, come on, let's raise the money to invest in another healthcare fund, I probably wouldn't have done it. But this was so novel, so new. And as you think about the needs with world population growth, to be able to hopefully identify technologies that could contribute to improved yield, and better crops, better food for the world to feed. That's a good reason to keep working, and that's been important. And I hope that we'll continue to do that with the team going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Andy, listen, it's been a wonderful chat. I loved hearing the stories and your experiences to get you where you are now, and a little bit about the fund and your goals and drivers. So thanks so much for coming on. Really enjoyed it.
Well, I enjoyed it too. Thanks for having me.
No.